Hi, this is Socialist Lynx. This is a part two to a series called The National Question in the 21st Century, and I'm going to be talking about basically racism and a whole bunch of other problems that basically goes on within capitalism and how it basically operates itself. So let's get started. Last time we basically gave introductions of basically what I was going to talk about, as well as some minor critiques now about about well the market socialists and some ultra left positions from left communists, and now referring to them as just ultra left positions. Now I'm going to be talking about the practice of racism in general and how that operates. When we talk about the oppression that the marginalized working class faces, we need to actually go back to the points on racism and what it means for racists, the people not experienced with racism, the people that have experienced racism, how racism comes about, and how it is most significant. Racism is a system of social constructs of society that even came up today of that even came up today of race in the first place. And acts as another form of class hierarchy to be able to have a labor force to be easily commanded to have a production process be used to have one benefit due to the mode of production that encourages such behavior in the first place. Like any other kinds of ideas and those ideas being put into action, racism has a theory and a practice. Thus, when there is theory and a practice of said theory, that then needs to have a unity of theory and practice, so that way the practice can be acted on effectively for the theory is what drew up the idea for a practice in the first place. This is something that Gregory Lukács talked about in his book History and Class Consciousness by Gregory Lukács. In it, he demonstrates the historical need with a system of ideas as a theory. This then gives ideas to put these systems of ideas into practice, and practice is thus a physical human action that is taken on the form of consciousness of the human in the first place. That is able to act on it in the material world, but wouldn't have done so if it weren't for the being's theory to do so in the first place. As stated in History and Class Consciousness by Gregory Lukács, when consciousness stands in such a relation in reality, can theory and practice be united? Only when consciousness stands in such a relation to reality can theory and practice be united. Before this to happen, the emergence of consciousness must become a decisive step, which the historical process must be taken towards the proper an end constituted by the wills of men, but neither dependent on human whim nor the product of human invention. But the historical function of theory is to make this step a practical possibility. Only when a historical situation has arisen, in which a class must understand if it is to assert itself, only when the fact that the class understands itself means that it understands society as a whole, and when in a consequence the class becomes both subject and object of knowledge. In short, only when these conditions are all satisfied will the unity of theory and practice, the protection of the revolutionary function of the theory, become possible. End quote. Gregory Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. This unity of theory and practice is called praxis, on the fact that it unifies together to create a system of theory and practice at the same time. Quote, for the destruction of the totalizing point of view disrupts the unity of theory and practice. Action, praxis, which Marx demanded before all else in his thesis on Feuerbach, is the essence the penetration of the transformation of reality. But reality can only be understood and penetrated as a totality, and only a subject which in itself a totality is capable of this penetration. End quote. Gregory Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. all these things make racism no different when it comes to this. For it is a prediction of rate. For it is the prediction of race in the first place, since it is known that there is no actual genetic code that can be found, or any inheritance of psychological cognitive features that can actually say there is a subspecies category among the species of Homo sapiens. Since, after all Homo sapiens are just known as humans, and the last existing species of the Homo genesis and Hominidae subfamily of African apes. Yet the idea of race is so prevalent. It is so prevalent because human society today, we have used racism as a way to justify loads of class rule to show something as inferior. This was first used in the emergence of slavery as an economic system in 3000 BCE. This is used to justify that there can be ownership of humans as property due to the fact that since they would have different skin color or plausible facial features, that this would mean that they are a slave, for they are quote-unquote inferior to the slaver that enslaves them, to build a class, objects, and form wealth so slavers may benefit from the labor of the enslaved class. This was defined. The classes in the mode of production of slavery. Then slavery was finally completely abolished as an entire economic system that spanned globally in the end of the Roman revolutions in 14 AD to 395 AD. For a while, the social construct of race still existed, and was used quite often in feudalism to have the landlordry blame a certain group of the peasantry, often Jews, Romani, and Czechs and Tibetans, often Jews, Romanis, Czechs, Tibetans, and others, for a famine or bad harvest during a season. Not really using it to justify their power, but trying to pin the peasantry and merchantry out against each other. Religion was more used to justify the theory of feudalism in the sense that the landlordry was chosen by God to rule over the population of a land, and God put them on a plot of land that a landlord would own to have a peasant work on that land, to then pay the landlord a tax to stay on that land. This tax was a surplus tax. Like very much how you basically pay money to basically stay on the house that you basically live in if you are renting it from a landlord. A peasant will have to basically pay via a product they produce in order to basically stay on the land that they live in, and also the land that they produce their food in. However, it did come back in feudalism during the stage of colonialism in this time, where Africans were forcibly brought into the colonies of North and South America, alongside with the indigenous Americans living there that were objectified as slaves, and the later peasants and then later peasants later on. But even in some places, there were just then integrated as peasants from slaves, like the colonists of France, Spain, and Portugal, in the colonies of Britain. They were just completely slaves and considered property. In fact, during this period of colonization, this is where terms to refer to people as black or white came from. It came from the fact that people with darker skin tones were made to be slaves, or made to be forced to integrate into the kingdoms and empires of Europe, while lighter skin tones were made to rule over the people with darker skin tones. This even kept on being a thing even with capitalism, despite the Haitian Revolution being one of the bourgeois revolutions that allowed capitalism to spring about, with other revolutions made by peasants and slaves with darker skin tones, such as the First Mexican Revolution, the Colombian Revolution, and the Brazilian Revolution. Even the Brazilian Revolution, slavery was still allowed and practiced within Brazil's capitalist mode of production, and in that started in 1835. This thus allowed feudalism with a slave law and remain, and even then capitalism with a slave law and remain. This is the only this was only finally abolished in America in 1865 after the Second American Revolution, made by workers themselves, made by workers that had basically forced the bourgeois state to abolish slavery. Similar things happened in the Rio riots that allowed slavery to be abolished in Brazil. However, these revolutions in America and Brazil didn't go far enough. Same with the rest of the world. There are still many ways on how racism can come about in relation to economics, and actually being more significant today in capitalism than any other system previously. This is the thing that Ian Vaush does not understand when talking about racism and capitalism today, and how racism in its very different relation with white people than black people. As well as racism is a lot more than just a prejudice against a race and believing one race is superior. As we can see from history of racism, the very idea of race is a social construct, as in it is a hierarchical based system of looking at people and putting that system of ideas for hierarchy into practice through what is referred to as discrimination. This is still prevalent today with the amount of problems and terrible conditions marginalized groups around the world face today. Let's fast forward to the end of our modern day. The U.S. government in the time has started touching blacks, sending drugs to in their communities, associating them with illegal drugs, and started killing them and brutalizing them left and right. They would leave a lot of black people who wanted freedom and their conditions better into prison, and would even kill them as well. What we have to understand here is that this problem won't go away by defunding the police or any armed bureaucratic institution made by the state. This kind of oppression was happening way before there was funding for the police. The funding of the police just made it easier. Black workers are still working long and hard hours. They're still getting paid less than what they are actually worth, and they have been suffering from this ever since the liberal revolution of America in the North, and the end of the American Civil War in the South. Before the Civil War, it was a lot, and even before the Civil War, it was a lot worse too. Worst part of most of this usually is justified and even ignored by employers that look to the Republicans and in Democrats alike, even in a worse way too, where Democrats would commodify their struggle and workers produce products to be exchanged in the market, sell that product to do the math as we pointed out earlier, and then pay them a wage, doing the exact kind of oppression that faces them in the first place. Of course, this problem is somewhat the same with the white descendant workers as well. But black people face the most of this when they are the ones trying to fight this. Yet Ian Vaush tries to downplay these actions and tells black people to unite into white-dominated circles like his to support the Democratic Party of America as a lesser evil to the Republican Party. Even though, to a revolutionary black communist worker, both these parties are just as responsible for racism in America and why it is prevalent, with no change actually being put forward to stop it, because these two parties are in the interest of the owning class and get funded directly and have their policies drawn up by the owning class, which the owning class interest is to stop the self-action of the proletariat from rising up against them through many different tactics, both using their own propaganda or the bourgeois state, which is factual and objectively true. This makes Ian Vaush and even Demon Mama not understand the current material conditions of the working class and how they face these conditions today in America, and what needs to be done to be able to truly bring about freedom. Ian Vaush in particular, however, are not really interested in that, at least in practice. because they are so focused on practice itself to the point they forget the entire point of why practice is needed in the sense there is an end to that practice of what they're fighting for, and the means have related to the path and have to relate to the path into getting the ends in the first place. This is consequentialism and pragmatism, specifically motive consequentialism, which is probably the better consequentialist philosophy. This is consequentialism, specifically motive consequentialism, which is probably the better consequentialist philosophy. Ian Vaush also claims himself to be a consequentialist, but he is a vulgar consequentialist that doesn't understand the point of consequentialism, and that just goes to an opportunistic actions that only provide more harm to the left than good. The point of consequentialism is not to just think that since actions have consequences, we should focus on the negative sides of consequences and avoid them as much as possible. It is to think that since our actions have consequences, we need to be able to take a deep analysis and understanding and our thinking as consequentialists, so that we can produce consequences that can fill an ends to a means. And those ends justify the means as long as the means are correlated to the ends. Therefore, the motive itself matters, and that motive needs a principle behind it. And this is the point of motive consequentialism that Vaush does not understand, where he takes into pragmatic consequentialist philosophy, a vulgar interpretation of consequentialism. Because again, practice doesn't really matter that much if there's no actual ends to the actual practice itself, which it does not seem Ian Vaush really does have an ends. Of course, Vaushites would then claim that you have an end, but this end is itself something that is obscure and something that entails that there's going to be more practice in the first place, such as the idea that there should be a transitionary socialist society of market socialism to then have the ends to basically be, a socialist society where workers have complete ownership of the means production. Not only is this vague, but this only entails that you're just really changing the actual powers of the means of production itself, rather than actually using a format where the market and where the mode of production itself can actually be challenged and be abolished. Therefore, this motive does not have a principle about it, and it only takes into a pragmatic consequentialist format, which is in of itself, again, unconsequentialist, and is a vulgar interpretation of what consequentialism even is supposed to be in the first place. The motives matter more into the consequences, but if it wasn't for the consequences in the first place with those motives, it wouldn't necessarily be into relation. It wouldn't necessarily have a significant relation in the first place. Just like in order for theory to justify itself, there needs to be a practice with that theory. Demon Mama is interested in the road for freedom of humanity, but this is only so far of her understanding of racism, which is still suggested that she still thinks of racism only in isolated individual understanding of racism as merely a prejudice, and not as a coercive institution and class struggle that discriminates the working class directly or indirectly by trying to have workers take to violent actions against others based on race, so that way the working class are still divided. Because of this, Demon Mama can't understand the idea of racism against white people, as in institutional racism, is false. Because of the fact that today, and for a long time since colonialism started, under feudalism, since 1506, the kind of racism that has existed has been the racism of white people dominating over others, especially people darker than them, and even excluding others from Europe being white, like Slavs, Poles, and Romanis. For racism is more than just a prejudice. It is a theory and a practice, and it has acted on with theory since the dawn of slavery in around 3000 BCE to the present day. This is why, on an institutional racism level, such as the form of discrimination that has occurred throughout history, you cannot really be racist towards white people. Today, in that factor, since colonialism, the stage of feudalism, this racism has been acted by whites against by white people against black people. There wasn't even a sense to even be called black or white as a person until the transatlantic slave trades that emerged in colonialism specifically. Like, think about that. Literally, no one was calling themselves white or black at all until the emergence of the transatlantic slave trade. That's what truly makes race as a social construct as it is. They only were able to label African and people from Africa with darker skin as black and as a black person as a way to be able to justify their ways to basically own another person entirely as a slave. Today, in that factor, since the colonialism stage of feudalism, this racism has been acted by white people against black people. There wasn't even a sense to be called black or white as a person until the transatlantic slave trade that emerged in colonialism. Thus, even by history, white people were not and still not are affected by racism as a practice. For what literally defined a person as a white person was a person enacting the racism to allow the accumulation of goods for their benefit as landlords and slaveholders in their interest, through the depravity of the peasants and the slaves of their freedom, dignity, home, and their interests. Therefore, logically, if we understand racism not as a prejudice, but as a theory of racism and practice that can unify into praxis, we can see racism towards white people is by function not racist. For white people historically are defined as the ones that committed the racism in the colonialism period. Not the fact that they were the ones that did it, but that they were literally defined as the ones that did it. Because white and a white person was to refer a person that actually owned people, and refer to them as a black person, to basically refer to them of a superior being versus a non-superior being. And that kind of idea was something that not only was just committed just by white people, but that itself was literally what we would define as a white person in the first place. Demon Mama and Ian Vaush abstracting the factual evidence that racism against white people around the world is a discrimination, and as well as a cultural level is non-existent today. As George Padmore analyzed the working class in South Africa in his work White Workers and Black by George Padmore. Quote, the European workers in South Africa constitute the most parasitic section of the international working class. Thanks to the color bar, they live in a style granted only by the higher placed workers and professionals in Britain. Obviously, they are interested in aligning themselves with the capitalists and exploiting the blacks. And the division of arbitrary created by aggravated by the fact the white workers form part of the alien racial minority, which is determined to maintain this domination over the native majority. End quote. George Padmore, White Workers and Black. And George Padmore was correct, for the division of white and black working class was too huge to the point that unions in South Africa sided with the bourgeois state of South Africa, using white supremacist justification and discriminatory actions for this action in the first place. And George Padmore was correct, for the division of white and black working class was too huge to the point that unions in South Africa sided with the bourgeois state of South Africa, using white supremacist justifications and discriminatory actions. Quote, to maintain this domination over the natives, no black worker is permitted to enter a white trade union. The European trade union movement in South Africa is represented by the Trades and Labor Council, composed of the Trade Congress and Cape Federation of Labor Unions and their affiliated craft unions and associations. They number about 100 and cover the engineering, mental, mining, building, printing, clothing, and food industries. Not only does the movement refuse entry to the blacks, but it declines unity with native organizations. The Industrial and Commercial Union, founded in 1919 by a young Nyasaland native, Clemens Kadali, was the first effort of organizing a black labor union, although conceived was purely trade union organization, and the very character of South African conditions forced the ICU to assume leadership of the political, as well as the purely economic struggles of the Negroes. Despite official persecution and hostility from the organized white labor, it gained enormous strength economically and became a formidable political power in the hands of the blacks. In 1928, the ICU addressed an appeal to the Trade Union Coordinating Committee. The organization combined the Trade Union Congress and the Cape Federation of Labor Unions, to be included with the white workers in a unified labor movement. In reply, the committee issued a memorandum acknowledging that sooner or later the national trade union movement would include all genuine labor and industrial organizations, irrespective of craft, color, or creed. The question is how and when. The document went on to suggest that a considerable amount of propaganda was needed among the union membership before affiliation can take place with benefit to all concerned. It generally feared that the membership of the black union would outvote the European organizations and force them to abandon their discriminatory practices. The fear of losing their privileged status is the bourgeoisie which haunts them, the white workers, and drives them into alliance with the capitalists against the natives. This unity of race as against a class amounts for the widespread racial chauvinism which permeates all strata of European population and makes the Union world's classic fascist state. For here, the racial minority of 1,800,000 mercilessly suppresses 6.5 million blacks in their own land, denying them the most elementary democratic and human rights. End quote. George Padmore, White Workers and Black. As well, with Ian Vaush bringing up the debate with Professor Flowers, is just derailing the conversation, abstracting the entire point of black people are oppressed in any kind of way. You think of the best way to combat that is the black working class themselves, with other workers of a different race, including white people, by the way, can work together on emancipation based on a collective partnership together in a vanguard party, where these workers can understand their emancipation is possible and even needed in the first place. This is the thing that Professor Flowers and Badmouth is trying to get at to the pragmatic left of YouTube, and the thing that many black Marxists themselves had already analyzed and already talked about, like C.L.R. James, George Padmore, Frantz Fanon, Huey P. Newton, Malcolm X, and even Fred Hampton. Just because black people want their own movements and be able to have their own freedom of a movement and their own struggle in the vanguard doesn't mean they're trying to split off from it or sabotage it, as Ian Vaush would basically suggest. But this isn't even what just black Marxists figured out in the late 1930s and early 1970s. This is something that Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, Karl Radek, Christian Rajkowski, Ivar Smilga, Evgeny Preobrazhensky, Eugen Varga, Joaquin Marin, Andres Nin, and the Weisbord Hermanos already figured out by 1920, and led the effort to have the entire Communist International make a thesis on the national liberation of black people in the United States of America, facing the huge amounts of discrimination at the time, and the Communist International did. The Communist International at the 98 percentage support, made a work officially making a Marxist analysis on the American revolutions taking place during the revolutions of 1917 to 23. The work is called "Is the Black Question" by the Communist International. But it wasn't just Russians and Spanish in 1920 and 22. It was also German communists, including Karl Marx, that figured this out in 1860, with the threat of the rise of the revolutionary situation in America getting started by slaves. But words are just words. Let's look at what they actually figured out. But before we actually look on what they actually figured out, we need to actually look to the specific historical trends that occurs within racism in the first place. North America is a continent that has the shortest period of slavery in history, while at the same time had the biggest degree of slavery in history compared to each slaveholder's estate in history, even when slavery existed as an entire economic system between 3000 BCE and 395 AD across the world. This was merely due to the productive forces of the new economic system, feudalism, that emerged after the fall of slavery. There was a large productive forces to build towns, roads, and buildings already accomplished without a need to use of slaves, as well as the mode of production of feudalism, being that the peasant was a laborer that lived in land owned by a landlord, and that the peasant would have to pay a fee as a tax from the landlord to stay on the land they live, sleep, and work on, where the peasant was still able to control their own hours and was still able to own their own means of production, just not the property they worked on itself, which was a property settled by feuds between families and lineages settled by a state that appointed the land. Hence, this was feudal property, hence the name itself being referred to as feudalism, where property was appointed based on the feuds of families, lineage, and appointed aristocrats. North America did not follow the same example of Europe, Africa, or Asia. However, neither did South America. Throughout the history of North America and South America, most of these areas that only covered through forms of tribalism, with the exception of the River Valley slave state, the Azteca slave states in northern Canada and central Mexico. Tribalism itself can be described as primitive communism. Yet the nature of peasants in Europe, Asia, and Africa was different from that of the tribesmen in North America and South America. That's because of one simple fact. Human nature is adaptable to the given mode of production of society that gives perspective and interest to other people based on that relation to production. The nature of a peasant is different from the nature of a proletarian. This is even adaptable based on the conditions of tribalism, where there was a classless, moneyless, stateless society based on the cooperation of the people in the given collective that would hunt, gather, and then labor what they got to survive together, thus having to meet other people's needs. Thus a society based off the ability of yourself and others and the needs of yourself and others. Also, before class societies, there was literally no evidence of social prejudices like racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, etc. Tribalism is definitely a great alternative. It still has problems in of itself. However, it still has problems in of itself by having the division of labor as a natural law to survive. This is where communism has to come in after socialism, where we abolish the division of labor and allowing people to have multiple roles in society for whatever they choose, just as an individual laborer and not just a freely associated, just as an individual laborer and not just a freely associated laborer. As best stated by an anthropological work, A People's History of the World by Chris Harman. Quote, hunters and gatherers were necessarily dependent on one another. The gatherers usually supplied the most reliable source of food, and hunters that was most valued. Those who were specialized in hunting depended on their daily survival, on the generosity of those who gathered. While those who specialized in gathering and those who were temporarily unsuccessful in the hunt relied for valued additions to their diet on those who managed to kill animals. The hunt itself did not usually consist of an individual male hero going off to make a kill, but comprised a group of men, sometimes with auxiliary assistance of women and children, working together to chase and trap prey. At every point, the premium was on cooperation and collective values. Without them, no band of foragers could have survived far more than a few days. End quote. Chris Harman, A People's History of the World. This is not able to have not only more people in North America than Europe because of the lack of harsh work conditions and bred disease, but also allowed further development of a peaceful continent that rarely saw wars and even drawn, and war itself being very much frowned upon in the most areas. This thus kept them not only a lack of desire for class domination, but allowed more actions to protect the environment and see each person be one with nature itself, instead of today, especially in capitalism, where humanity acts as if they are outside of nature. There was war and there was class societies in central Mexico and northern Canada, but it wasn't into the significance of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It all changed eventually, namely in 1492, with the start of colonialism as a stage of feudalism that allowed kingdoms to expand into empires. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, on behalf of the Spanish landlordry and the monarchy, set out to try to prove that he can sail around the earth and make it to India, because he thought the earth was 20,000 miles smaller than what it actually was. And he was absolutely wrong. But he did one thing during his voyage on his stupid journey conquer land, pillage tribes, rape women, enslaved natives to them, bestow them as peasants, and came back with riches and plunder for the Spanish landlordry and monarchy. The Spanish landlordry, namely Queen of Spain, Elizabeth Catolica, the first of Castile, and Duke of Basilie and Prince of Serrano, and the House of Trastamara, Alfonso de Colavira of Aragon. This then lead to even more expeditions and conquers not just North America, but South America as well, namely, with the mission of an Italian merchant working on behalf of the King of Spain, Fernando Catolica II of Aragon, the Queen of Spain, Elizabeth Catolica I of Castile, and King of Portugal, Manuel Venturoso the first of Beja. The merchant being Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci is the guy that actually discovered that the place Christopher Columbus landed on was not India or even Asia, for that matter. Rather, it was a continent that no one knew about except for the landlordry of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They had previously pillaged and conquered areas in Greenland and Vinland. In the most famous of their landlord lineage, being of Leif Erikson of Vinland, Ragnar Lothbrok of Denmark, Harald Hardada III of Norway. With this discovered waves of soldiers for landlords of not just Spain and Portugal, but also France, England, and Scotland, and later, after the Dutch Revolution had faced a counter-revolution, the Netherlands. Only the landlordry of Spain, France, England, now just Britain after the conquering of Scotland and Ireland, and Portugal would remain, however, with Spain being the most dominant landlord state. The continent he then claimed to have discovered was named after him through his first name as Amerigo to America. This is the period that would be notable as colonialism and would be the center of the stage that would bring class models into the Americas and would force North America and South America to become a part of Europe through blood and conquest by forcefully instituting slavery to focus their mode of production and infrastructure and profit from the trade of property and people as property, and then feudalism to just tax the shit out of people living there for the landlords that owned that land to expand their own wealth. However, due to the natives in North America and South America being killed through exposure to diseases, massacres, rebellions against their conquerors, and straight up genocide against them, it was during this time when slavery was instated into North America and South America, and this was the moment that slavery would later become the most profitable and most biggest form of labor in the United States of America, Republic of Cuba, and the First Republic of Brazil in capitalism. As well, this was the first time where Haiti would bring about the modern form of racial hierarchy, as well as even understand today as we understand today in capitalism. Haiti was very diverse and very different, and was a very different country in the feudal and European influenced world than most other countries in the rest of the world. But just like America, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, millions of Africans would be kidnapped and forcibly brought over to Haiti to be nothing but centers and free labor for landlordry and a small section of the merchantry, where they would either just be slaves for the rest of their lives or would end up given up as property would have to work not as thralls but as serfs, which although different and as peasants they would have protections as people rather than considered as property. The fact that the landlord would still have people work labor and pay rent for the land they lived in would still be oppressive and repressive against the interests of the kidnapped Africans forcibly brought into Haiti against their will and were unable to return, as well as the lack of consideration of the safety of peasants in general, where there is excessive taxation for rent of someone to live on the land, like that of what happened in France and America. Then the peasant population would starve while the landlords would get wealthier repeatedly just by taking the products of someone else's labor, so that they can stay on the land they live on and have lived on since childhood. This is the economic system of Haiti, like that of America, except more brutal and more oppressive feudalism, with a slave law in remain. Haiti's feudalist oppression was the origins of the modern-day race hierarchy in the sense of both the ways on how people are characterized and treated based on the social construct that of race. It was the introduction of feudalism in North America and South America that allowed for there to be any form of way where people would be considered as a white person or a black person, based on the kind of people who would be landlords and slaveholders or peasants and slaves. Haiti was the most prevalent of this form of racism, for the fact that feudalism and slavery in Haiti would be justified based on the eyes of the landlord state of France at the time, based on the racial lines, which would be defined by nationality and skin color. This view of race by the landlord states of Britain, Spain, and France, especially France, was a way where there can be violence orchestrated by the landlord state's armed body through legislative and judicial means, as a way where they can act in the interest of the ruling class over the non-ruling class. An armed body like that of the Guard and Standing Army, where they protect landlords' property and apprehend escaped slaves, as well as disorganize and even have authority to kill peasants and slaves willingly, if they do not comply to the orders of the Guard and Standing Army of the landlord state. Like any state, it is an authority of a ruling class over a non-ruling class that uses violence through legislative and judicial means. But contradictions occur when the mode of production is changed and the class struggle's function changes. Thus, with each contradiction, there is new things added to the given state that allows it to defend class struggle. Not the fact that the core functions of the state at hand and how it operates is an authority of a ruling class over a non-ruling class that uses violence through legislative and judicial means. Because we look at these contradictions in detail and see that while it may operate in more specific ways, there's still a pattern even with these technicalities that come back to the total when unifying the opposites in this concept. In the landlord state of Haiti, it is different. It did something just like that. Within the Haitian racial hierarchy in relation to the feudalist class struggle of Haiti, it was divided by obviously race and class in Haiti. Let's start with the ruling class of Haiti around this time, known as the La Grand Blancs. The Grand Blancs were white plantation owners and even landlords that have been given land to govern over by the autocracy and monarchy of France. So they may tax a surplus from the peasantry of the land and the peasants were bestowed on. These Grand Blancs were overwhelmingly landlords that had titles bestowed on them as a lineage for wealth for generations and generations, just by taking what they desire in the name of sustainability of the state and feudalism. But now, for the first time, they were even able to expand outside of the feudal state and establish their own colonies, where they themselves can be declared governors of colonies and have the power of a king. That land they were granted declared governors of colonies to have. To have governorship over. These people would obviously live in big estates from humongous mansions to literal palaces, not even in Haiti, but rather just mainland France. But when they did live in Haiti, they made it clear the land was conquered by the French landlordry or their own purposes to accumulate more wealth, such as the city of Le Cap, Haiti, where it almost looks like 18th century Paris, France, and with a town in the center of bouquets, sit-out cafes, and even a theater in towns in the town center alone. But it wasn't just the Grand Blancs that had enslaved and had ruling class positions within Haiti. There was an entire generation of Africans that were freed from slavery and servitude as a peasant, and was accepted as sons for Grand Blancs. These were the Ossavier gens de couleur libre, which in English translates to the enslaving free people of color. Free people of color in Haiti and France in general was very sudden, even for the fathers of the free people of color when they emerged. And they emerged in general because when Haiti was colonized, there was more French white men than French white women, and many French white women were already being taken as housewives or as concubines. This led to enslaved women coerced to violently forced to having sexual relations with French men that resulted into pregnancy. Because of this, many whites would then either marry their courtiers or free the child resulting from the courting. Because of this, it created a new kind of people that the entire world had to address not as slaves but as people of color for the first time. However, although they weren't property, they were able to even be landlords and own land, with peasants bound on land, and even own slaves and property they themselves can rule over without consequence. Since they were black, they weren't allowed to vote in autocratic plenaries or royal halls. Because of this, although having a ruling class position to that of a landlord, they were seen as inferior to white landlords because of their skin color and racial genealogy. But it didn't really matter because the majority of the enslaving free people of color didn't go to France. Instead, they chose to stay in Haiti and develop generational influences of their own kind, establishing their own lineage not as black people but as free people of color, going in so far to enslave their own people from the same land that they were kidnapped from. Some free people of color, though, actually opposed slavery and thought to go for what they saw as a more noble social relation to the means production, that they saw a possibility to be merchants. This leads to another group of people to be talked about, called the Petit Blancs in Haiti. These people were a mixture of peasants and merchants within Haiti that went to Haiti to get some fertile land for themselves, and also find different business opportunities in these colonized land, particularly in Haiti, when sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton was the most accumulated surplus grown from harvested by peasants and slaves, to be accumulated either as a tax for a peasant or as a right of property, since the slave is also property. Thus, anything made by a slave is the property of the slaveholder. Some of these social relations of the peasantry and merchantry was also with the free people of color. And in fact, majority of the free people of color made up the large merchantry in Haiti, which led to them having more major support for liberal ideas against feudalism, while at the same divided on whether or not they should strive for the abolitionism of slavery in Haiti. The people outnumbered the Grand Blancs by slaveholding free people of color by 3-1. Finally, there were the enslaved, the lowest class in Haiti. Specifically, only black people would be considered slaves in Haiti, and would have to serve their slaveholdry and their wishes for them, and the slaveholdry could do what they desired to the enslaved, if they were allowed to, which in Haiti they were. The enslaved at Haiti was a population that outnumbered the slaveholdry, the merchantry, and the merchantry from 10-1, and outnumbered the peasantry from 8-1. This group was so vulnerable and was so oppressed, and the yearly death rates of Haiti in Haiti from 1506 to 1786, it is shown that half of the deaths were deaths of slaves, because it was cheaper and more cost efficient to just let the half of the enslaved die per year than kidnap a new set when the starting month of the next year. These people were exposed to diseases, dysfunctions, and malnutrition. If anyone dared to escape, they would serve punishments ranging from whipping to torture via amputation of genitalia. As well as a slave was majorly injured to the point it hindered their capabilities for labor. They would just straight up kill their slave and burn their body. These people were not even considered people, just property to be used by their slaveholders. However, they wished they would like to use them, because they are considered property of the slaveholdry, which would define them to be enslaved. For a long time, when colonialism was implemented, it was mostly a way where the landlordry of feudalism can expand a bigger peasantry for them to accumulate and tax more of a surplus that is generated by the peasants that would work on land and bestowed in. And the same for to have a huge control over goods and services in their hands over the merchantry that didn't have their own peasantry and was just trying to sell commodities. They could manage to get their hands on. Because of that, in places like America, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and other places in North America and South America that was colonized by landlord states, this was what was able to bring feudalism into two continents. However, with the enhancement of the rise of classes worldwide, came with also the rise of the class struggle in those classes worldwide. Thus, the class struggle will take place in the most enhanced physical form that is the hero of all history and class society. because through the history of class struggle comes within the class struggle coming into full battle with each other in class war. That class war, by function, is, was, and will be revolution. This is where we talk about the history and the practice of racism and the transformation of feudalism to capitalism and the attempts to actually resist and actually abolish racism around this time. The first actual successful revolution that occurred against feudalism was in England through the English Revolution that took place from 1642 to 1551. Pretty short compared to most revolutions against feudalism that only occurred around 30 years after the events of the Dutch Revolution. Except the Dutch Revolution of 1588 to 1608 was a revolution that took place where the landlordry was reestablished, and also there's no actual suppression of tenant taxing by 1596. The revolution due to the counter-revolutionary ideals and forces at the time that where it forced merchants and peasants to cede power to their leaders to become landlords to have a supposed effective fighting chance against the previous landlords of Spain and of Spain. The English Revolution was different, however, yet it still made compromises with the landlordry and did not actually abolish serfdom or tenant taxing for a while which would lead to a revolution in America. But it did start using the market even more and started having money be used as a way where goods would be more distributed to not just landlords but merchants and peasants for the first time in history. This wasn't a big move on the suppression of tenant taxing, but it was at the very least at the time an effective effort to suppress it, and somewhat did. But even then, there would be later other successes in America, France, Haiti, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Sweden, Naples, and Switzerland. But to first look at the revolutions of 1773 to 1824, we need to look at the English Revolution from 1642 to 51. The English Revolution is definitely the most confusing and contradictory bourgeois revolution, however. We must understand here, it wasn't really the landlord class winning over the merchant and peasant classes during the revolution. Rather than through conservative thought and politics, it tried to find a dual power between the landlordry and the merchantry and peasantry. However, after the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the merchantry and peasantry started to dominate over the landlordry, and the proletariat bourgeoisie was emerging in England, thus finding a more concrete and more practical, at the same time more planned revolutionary alternatives of the revolutions of 1773 to 1824. Let's first look where it started, then the most significant, and then the last. For this will be the most significant and more defining revolutions that would later allow racism to still persist, and what made after these revolutions. That, of course, being capitalism, an entire economic system by the early 1820s. In 1773, the American Revolution officially broke out through the Boston Tea Party revolt, where merchants dressed up as indigenous Americans that of mostly the Iroquois tribe, and threw out tea off ships owned by landlords in Britain, that those landlords had gathered from the labor of their peasants in Virginia, Georgia, and even in Vinland, known as Newfoundland. What followed was the declarations of independence of the American colonies, and declared themselves as the United States of America in 1775. After trying countless times to compromise with the landlordry of Britain, the merchantry and the peasantry of America had enough of being taxed and the world dominance of declared independence. However, revolutionary situations that had led to the revolution had been happening in America since 1765 with the Boston Massacre. New York riots against the Stamp Act, etc. Many historians, even some Marxist thinkers, try to ignore the actual significance of the American Revolution had in building capitalism into place worldwide, just as with the French Revolution. But I think this is a downplay on the events and is very wrong. There was feudalism in America, actually, both in North and South, from lords in England, where they were able to be appointed land by the monarchy. This is antagonistic for the merchant classes in America, where they wanted to expand profit, but the feudal system of limiting exchange was halting any way for more access to commodities to sell, and more grain just to be taxed in hopes of it being redistributed. The American Revolution was indeed a bourgeois revolution against feudalism in America, and a fight from the merchantry and the peasantry against the nobility and slavers. This is best stated by American Marxist economist and historian Harry Braverman in his fantastic historical work, Class Forces in the American Revolution by Harry Braverman. Quote, "The American Revolution was directed and the fruits were harvested by a coalition of two classes, the building North American bourgeoisie and the southern landowning aristocracy. For 3/4 of a century thereafter, a revolution of the two classes of mutual relations were determined to the major degree of the course of American history. Their struggles were cut from the main channels in which events would flow. These two classes were particular into the special types of landowning and bourgeois classes. They were planted on the shores of a rich and vast continent by an already developed Western European civilization. They had no feudal antecedents to this country, nor did necessarily replicate the European stages in the course of their growth, and the hitherto unprecedented conditions create an American social structure of the minimum to excess baggage in the form of feudal rubbish. The dead hand of the dead hand passed a lay lightly on the American brow. A society of exceptional vigor and directness was developed. The difference between the North and the South, which led to the differing social relations of the diminisher ruling class, were accumulated by the natural conditions encountered by the early settlers. Appalachian range within the 2 centimeter delimited on the field of the colonists forms the angle of the Atlantic coastline intersections, which in the north. Thus further south, one proceeds to the broader alluvial belt, and necessarily so staple crops cultivation in the north can be where the mountains lie close to the coast. The fall line of the rivers correspondingly close. Thus, the rivers and streams of New England were navigable for only a short distance from their month. The New England settlements hagged the coast of such agricultural produce as was raised in the interior that was not too readily floated to market. The southern states, quite opposite, possessed the vast agricultural domain within the belt allotted them to the Atlantic and Appalachian boundaries. Broad rivers, navigable by ocean, going vessels for a long distance of the interior, were provided by nature as as territories of commerce. The preconditions of a land of great plantation were ready and waiting. A cheap labor supply, as easily cultivated crop, a ready market, were all required to the establishment of the plantation systems. The first was provided partly endured servants, but primarily by Negro by slavery. The second, the planters found in tobacco and the growing addictions of Europe to the new and popular habit, the planters found their market. Thus, by the beginning of the 18th century, a plantation system resting primarily, in fact, almost exclusively on tobacco was dominant through Virginia and Maryland. In South Carolina and Georgia, the same system resting upon rice as the cheap staple was prevalent around 1750. Indigo was introduced into these two states and soon reigned a close section. North Carolina added to the cultivation of rice, tobacco, and indigo, the larger scale export of lumber and naval stores. The plantation were huge in area. Their owners were powerful, and towns were small and unimportant. The political hegemony under these conditions fell to the plantation owners. This owning class was a blood cousin of the land-owning class in all history, and yet possessed a certain particularities given the great revolutionary significance of the American history in the first place. It possessed no feudal history. The feudal restrictions and on land tenure were slight and only such as the British aristocracy and the American allies could impose from afar. Even these remnants of feudalism were soon to be swept away by the Revolution. Secondly, the Southern plantation owner was a producer for the world market for the very first. His economic position thus gave the interest and activities a more cosmopolitan cast of the common and the land-owning classes. True, he could not rival with the respect of the merchant of a busy New England port, and yet throughout the South, ocean-going vessels tied at the private docks of planters whose lands of the broad rivers and the news of the world was at their front door. The third, particularly Southern agricultural ruling class, carried the most revolutionary potentialities. In this, while the raised crops themselves, the planters did not market them. The produce of the South, marked by the British merchants, those whose British and Scotch agents and factors were concentrated in the coastal towns for the purpose of acting for British mercantile houses. End quote. Harry Braverman, Class Forces in the American Revolution. Probably the most hard-hitting argument he provides with evidence in this passage in the article, where here he talks about basically the emergence of the bourgeoisie after the revolution in America, as well on the specific governance that was actually able to benefit the merchantry within America that would later establish themselves as the bourgeoisie. Thus, they prospered under the British system, and therefore they acquiesced in it. True, the restrictions of the manufacturers pinched here and there, but manufacturers were a minor interest of the bourgeoisie. At the same time, it was doubtful that they would have grown more rapidly than they did in the restrictions that been removed. True, also the Parliament laws protecting credit were aimed at American debtors of the London merchants and bankers, but these laws operate and provide excellent credit terms for the American merchants. End quote. Harry Braverman, Class Forces in the American Revolution. I think, and especially this quote kind of hits home the actual argument that feudalism did exist within America. Actually. Quote, they propose under the British system, therefore, that they... This is the quote I was talking about, sorry. Alright, anyways. Quote, in the struggle of the crown led by the merchant-planter coalition, the merchants were the most fickle side of the partnership, having a golden age of prosperity such as the planters never had enjoyed in their history. They contended for a return of the old system of the smallest concession of the crown was sufficient to breed consultationism among them. In addition, their fear of their energetic allies in the cities brought them an attempt to restrain the movement or abandon it wholesale. In this situation, it developed upon the radicals to give the movement in the cities its continuity and intercessions. End quote. Harry Braverman, Class Forces in the American Revolution. What all of this shows is that the American Revolution was indeed a bourgeois revolution against feudalism in America, and a fight from the merchantry and the peasantry against the nobility and slavers. Therefore, capitalists are hypocrites when they try to criticize the act of revolution, when capitalism literally came from an international wave of revolution. This relates to racism because it is the particular revolution where black slaves were kidnapped and forcibly brought over by the standing armies and landlord states brought to them in North America to be able to be instituted as slavery to be able to be into slavery in the continent, and later feudalism after the indigenous American population significantly shrank due to disease exposure and genocide. Because of this, these people from Africa were kidnapped, and they had to endure and go through the kind of oppression that not even a peasant or merchant, whose was white, who was white, would ever understand. They were kidnapped, had to go through the most inhumane conditions and an unsanitary state during their forced travel from Africa to North America. One would be lucky that they managed to live while they were be able to live. While there was urine, feces, rats, and human carcasses carrying bacteria that would kill a man in just 4 days. By the time they got to North America, those men, women, and children would realize why they were taken there. They would be taken off and branded as a number, as their new name or a new name by their owner, or given a new name by their owner, and be nothing more than property, an object to an owner. With the English Revolution and more equal treatment for peasants and merchants came. By 1551, of order from the British monarchy, specifically from the parliamentary elected order to King Edward Tudor Seymour VI of England and Ireland, to announce that peasants and merchants can buy and sell slaves as property for their own desire, and meaning exchange with the British pound sterling as the needed tender for exchange. Although peasants wouldn't really get a chance to actually buy slaves due to the fact that they had no way of getting any income, and they were self-managing themselves. They were just self-managing themselves and would have to pay a product tax for the landlord to stay on the land they lived on. They would make money through exchange of goods to a merchant if they managed to actually do so, with the merchant offering to buy something off the peasant. Because of this, slavery increased in the American colonies even before the Revolution. But when the Revolution broke out, slaves opted to join the Revolution, hoping they would change. There would be change for them to gain their freedom by their own actions that are in support for the independence of the American colonies as the United States of America against the United Kingdoms of Britain. Some did, but this would really only happen in 1778, when the majority of the country allowed slaves that would be able to fight in the Revolution be free from the ownership by another person. But this is only in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. In the rest of the states of this federation of bourgeois states, even when slaves would fight in the Revolution, they were just back to being slaves, or they managed to kick out their previous owners. Only then to be brought by another person and become a slave for a different owner after and even during the Revolution. This was a step forward, yes, but a step forward not for the slaves, or even the majority of peasants for that matter, but one for the merchantry that would be able to have a bigger supply of commodities to sell in the future market after the Revolution, to make themselves more wealthy and more economically stable for themselves and their loved ones and close friends. While the rest were either become workers for the property that own and hire them to produce commodities based on the labor time they would perform while their labor power is bought, or to actually buy a human, or to actually buy human beings based off the price that they bought them as a representation of value of a commodity, just as a worker would be when the labor power is bought and sold. This was the intentions of the leaders of the American Revolution, known as the Founding Fathers, and the leading classes of the Revolution. Those classes, a small section of the peasantry and the entire merchantry. It was the classes with their class interests that led to the capitalism and chattel slavery to be used in capitalism that made America have capitalism with a slave law and remain. Like how Russia from 1861 to 1916 had capitalism with a feudal law and remain. The reason is actually quite explainable. Would profit the bourgeoisie that emerged in America after the American Revolution was finished in 1791, and capitalism being instituted in America in 1819 to 20. Slavery and capitalism can go hand in hand because slaves are the cheapest labor possible to be able to produce commodities, and thus can act as workers that are somehow independent and are able to live by themselves as people. While at the same time to be able to act as private property themselves, to work on private property too for a certain amount of labor time into the workday producing commodities that they would not get paid for, that both the surplus value they produce and the price of their labor power both go to the slave or bourgeois. This was the capitalist system in the southeast of the United States of America, where slaves acted as the proletariat for the bourgeoisie, such as the Mississippi Mining Company, the Clothing Company of Georgia and Alabama, and the Seawater Incorporated Institute of America, to name a few. As Karl Marx analyzed this specific kind of capitalism in one of his great works known as A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy by Karl Marx, this is very much a case, and I'll add what he says here. Quote, firstly, then, the division into necessary labor and surplus labor for the reproduction of one's own labor capacity and labor for the owner of the conditions of production is merely clearly more distinctly apparent from the form of corvée labor than in the form of wage labor. Secondly, however, it follows from the appearing more clearly in the corvée form than in wage labor, that the surplus labor is unpaid labor, and the whole of surplus value is reduced to surplus labor, i.e. unpaid labor. If the corvée laborers work 5 days of the week on their own land, and the 6th day of the landowners, it is clear that this 6th day they perform unpaid labor. They work for themselves, but for another. They work for themselves, but they work not for themselves, but for another, and that all the recipients of this other person are the product of unpaid labor. It is called corvée labor precisely for that reason. If factory workers work 2 hours out of 12 every day for the capitalist, it is the same as if they worked 5 days of the week for themselves. And one for the capitalist. Hence, in effect, the same as if they performed 1 day of corvée labor a week for the capitalist. The form of wage is absent into the whole corvée system, and it makes the relation yet more tangible. The corvée laborer receives the conditions of production required for the realization of his own necessary labor. He is allotted them once and for all. He therefore pays his own wage or directly appropriates the product of his necessary labor. With the wage laborer, in contrast, of the whole of his product is first converted into capital in order to flow back from the subsequently in the form of wages. If the corvée laborer who works 1 day in the week for his lord had to hand over to him the product the whole week, so that the lord could convert it into money and pay back 5 out of 6 of this money into the corvée laborer, the latter would be turned into a wage laborer in this respect. Inversely, the wage laborer who works 2 hours every day for the capitalist were himself to pocket the product of the value of the product of 5 days of his labor, deductions from the value of the conditions of production and material and means of the labor take place in both situations, even in different forms. And for capital during the sixth day for nothing, he would have turned into a corvée laborer. Insofar as the nature of the necessity of labor and surplus labor and their relationship come into consideration, the result is the same. End quote. Karl Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. As we can understand here, Karl Marx is very much showing on how slavery can go hand in hand with capitalism. Now, we must understand the most violent revolutions of 1773 to 1824 that reaffirmed racism and capitalism. This would be the French Revolution of 1789 to 1794 and the Haitian Revolution of 1793 to 1804. But that's a video for another time because this video is already getting long as it is. Plus, I think this is a good starting point on ending basically the formats of the American Revolution to then later talk about the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution in another video. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, hit the like button down below. I would very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I'd also very much appreciate it. Thank you for watching this video. And if you're new to my channel, yeah, hit the subscribe button and share this video if you guys want to. Yeah, anyways, thank you for watching this video. And Socialist Lynx is out.